Discussion. I'm Susan Giroux, and I am one of the co-editors-in-chief of the Journal of Learning Sciences. My amazing co-editor that I collaborate with is Zhenwei Zhang, and he cannot be here today, but he wishes he could be. Thank you to the Society for the Learning Sciences for being our sponsor of the journal, and to Ishita Pradhan. Thank you, Ishita, and just wave your hand so everyone can see you, for being our social media coordinator and helping to organize us today. This is a thrilling special issue that Keith and Erica organized. I mean, first of all, Keith and Erica are leaders in this space of thinking about the arts and thinking about creativity and thinking about learning and what this means for how we theorize cognition. We're so honored that they use the Journal of Learning Sciences as a space for having these ideas to share them. And if people have not yet read the articles in the special issue, I really encourage you to do so. They're beautiful. They're really pushing on the boundaries of how we are theorizing learning. And that's exactly what the Journal of Learning Sciences is trying to do. We're a space for illuminating the processes of learning. So not just what we're learning, but how we're learning, with what kinds of tools and towards what ends. So I'm really honored yet again that you're using the journal for this issue. And thank you to all of the authors who are here today to share and who contributed to this issue. I will pass it to our amazing special issue editors. Thank you.
Well, good. Thank you. And thank you so much to Susan and also to Zhenwei Zhang for co-editing the journal and then for the support of the special issue. Before their term as co-editors of the journal, when we submitted the proposal for the special issue, I would like to acknowledge that at that time, it was the prior team of journal co-editors, which was Jean van Alst and Susan Yoon. And we're grateful to them as well for going through the review process, and of course for accepting our proposal, which was back in March 2020. So this has been going on from, I guess, for over 2 years for us, right? So I've heard that some of you are interested in recording. I think all participants have the opportunity to say yes or no. So the recording is available. Good. Okay, I'm going to start by providing just a brief overview of the special issue. Erica and I, as co-editors, wrote the first article in the special issue as an introduction, and my comments are going to be followed by each of the contributors giving about a 5-minute summary of their article. 2 of the contributors cannot be here, so Erica and I, as the co-editors, are going to be summarizing those articles. Okay, let me share my screen here. I've got a couple of fun pictures for everyone to see. Of course, the home screen with a poster, and Ishita was the one who designed this, I believe. Here are the 6 papers in the special issue. I'm not going to read out every title because during the webinar, you'll be hearing them once or twice. So the 6 papers start with the introduction by Erica and I as the co-editors. Then we have 4 articles that represent the core of the special issue with original research contributions and using analyses of original and gathered data. And then the 6th article is a commentary, which is typical for special issues, to have a senior scholar in the field to, after all the articles have been completed, this senior scholar reads them all and provides an integrative commentary on common themes and the general impact and influence of those 4 core articles. So we're very honored to have Parita Satama-Hakkarainen from University of Helsinki as the author of the commentary. She won't be here with us today, so I'll be the one summarizing that article. For the 3rd article on the list, those authors also will not be here, so Erica Halverson will be summarizing that article. All right, here's us, the co-editors. These photos taken from our websites. This is Erica Halverson. As I've said, she'll be summarizing Ty Hollett et al.'s article. And then there's me. We are creativity researchers, right? So I thought I'd choose the creativity pictures. Okay, so I'm going to paste into our chat some links to Erica and I so that, I won't have to say that much about us, but if you're interested, you can follow these links. Okay, well, yeah, I guess they're not links. So there's Erica, ericahalverson.com. I'm keithsawyer.com. So Erica and I wrote the special issue introduction, and there we explain why we believe the arts are central to our understanding of learning and knowing. We think the arts are important to all research in the learning sciences. We don't think of arts education as being a separate area that's all by itself that has no implications for any other people who study learning. We think that the findings from studying arts education, arts knowing, and arts learning, those findings have implications for all researchers in the learning sciences, even those who study STEM fields. And of course, STEM education research is predominant in the learning sciences. Most of our colleagues are studying science education or math education, a few studying other disciplines, but those studying arts education is a fairly small number. But after all, learning scientists, we're not just researchers in one discipline. Learning scientists who study biology education or physics education, they're not only interested in how to teach those subjects better, right? There are science education researchers who focus just on physics education or chemistry education. But in the learning sciences, we're interested in fundamental principles about how people learn and fundamental principles about what knowing is and what people know. So any type of research we do on a learning environment, it is not only about that learning environment, but we want to make general findings that apply to learning more generally, fundamental understandings of how the mind works and how groups of people work together when learning is taking place. So as learning scientists, Erica and I take that approach as well. We're interested in arts education, and we both spent our careers studying arts education, but really we're interested in not just in the arts, but also in what it tells us about cognition and learning, what it tells us about what knowledge is, how people think, what goes on in people's minds and in teachers and learning environments when learning is most effective. So yes, I would say it's the same with arts education researchers as it is with learning scientists who study science or math education. It's not just about the discipline, but it's about more fundamental principles about knowing and learning. That's how we approach the special issue. And that was Erica and my advice to all of the contributors that yes, you will be telling us about unique empirical findings, and you'll be using unique and interesting theoretical frameworks to interpret those findings. But we wanted the articles to speak to all learning scientists, not only people who study the arts. And that's why we picked the Journal of the Learning Sciences for the special issue rather than an arts education journal. The purpose of all of these articles is to speak to a broader community of learning scientists, not only arts education. From my perspective, what brings all of this together is creativity, right? The arts are grounded in creativity, and it's not just the arts. And this is a link between arts practice and art teaching and learning and all the other fields, is the focus on creativity and creative practice. So we have that in the design professions. We have that increasingly focus in the STEM fields. And this was about 20 years ago, just after 2000, when we started to hear business leaders and politicians beginning to emphasize the need to foster creativity and innovation in graduates in all subjects. So people like Erica and I and our colleagues, we saw that broader shift in society. And this is not just in the United States, but this was international with efforts on the part of the OECD, for example, in many countries in Asia and in Europe, a general focus on the importance of creativity in society. So 20 years ago, when this was going on, Erica and I and our colleagues, we saw an opportunity. We said, we really have something to say here because we're studying the arts, and the arts are fundamentally engaging with creative practice. But for the most part, up to that time anyway, the arts were considered something like a luxury, right? Or a leisure time activity. And arts education was thought of, it's an easy break, right? It's a time to get away from the harder work of learning math and science. So arts education is often considered to be optional, especially in schools, right? Not necessarily a priority. And our goal with the special issue was not simply to describe how researchers are studying arts teaching and learning. Of course, our articles do that, but we want to talk about what these studies tell us about teaching and learning with implications for learning sciences research in all disciplines. So I'm going to close with our bold claim. We claim that arts practices can serve as new models for learning. So in our introduction article, in the special issue, we provide a brief overview of this history I've mentioned with the cognitive sciences, and the field of arts education has gone through some of the same paradigmatic shifts as the rest of the learning sciences. In the 70s and 80s, more of a focus on cognition and the individual. In the 90s and onwards, a shift to a more sociocultural approach, practice-based, embodied, embedded, extended cognition, very much core to what we're doing in arts education research. Let's see, I think I have one more slide here. Yes, I do. Okay, these are recent books by Erica and I. This one, How the Arts Can Save Education, very recently published by Erica, Teachers College Press, and then my book from 2019, also by Teachers College Press. Thank you to Teachers College Press on both of our behalves. Erica and I have a lot in common, not just that we both study arts education. Erica studies arts learning and situated practice in a variety of contexts. She studies the maker movement. She studies digital media literacy and youth media organizations. She studies community arts for youth, all of those deeply situated and embedded in practice. In my case, I study arts and creativity in jazz ensembles and improvisational theater ensembles. Both of those very much collaborative and situated and sociocultural context. And I also study pedagogical practices in colleges of art and design, which Erica is also studying. We're both studying this notion of the critique in colleges of art and design. And we see a lot of that as well in the articles in this special issue. Okay, that's it for our introduction, Erica and I, with our introductory article. And now I'm going to introduce the contributors, the authors of each article in turn, and we'll go in the order that the articles were published in the journal special issue. I'm going to introduce just the speaker who's here today, and then that speaker will mention all of their co-authors and then tell us the title of your article, and then give us 5 minutes. I'm going to try to keep everyone to 5 minutes for their article summary. So first of all, I'll begin with the first article, or the first core article. It's really the second article after our introduction, and I'm going to introduce Kim Sheridan.
Great, thank you, Keith. I'm really excited to share our work, and I'm here today also with my co-author, Abby Konopaski, and our other co-author, Xiaorong Zhang, is not able to join us today, but her spirit is reflected in the work itself. And the article that we did, I actually have to look at the title because it's long. It is Strategic Shifts, How Studio Teachers Use Direction and Support to Build Learner Agency in the Figured World of Visual Arts. And in this work, we're, the study done with my colleagues, it's centered on what I see as a really critical pedagogical question that's central to the arts. And really, in my view, to all of education, that is, how do teachers support arts agency, students' agency in creative open-ended work. And so all too often, education is not considering kind of creative open-ended work. And so when they give students open-ended projects, they sometimes lack techniques to provide the support needed to share their insights and to support it. So students sometimes struggle with the open-endedness of creative work. And so what we thought was that the visual arts are paradigmatic in the sense of the whole game of teaching and learning in the visual arts is to support a unique vision using the tools and techniques and established conventions of the visual arts. But the aim, and this is reflected in even in the national standards of education, is to generate problems, to find problems, to pursue personal interest, to create an expressive vision. Over and over, the standards really reflect this sense of students are expected to build artistic agency. And so with that in mind, the studio classroom becomes the place where we can really see how teachers navigate that tension between supporting somebody's individual expression and agentive expression, at the same time building their competency enough to enact that vision. And so kind of this tension between providing a lot of open-endedness, but also equipping students with the creative process, the reflective tools and techniques to enact their intentions, and even to find what they want to make. Because anyone who's made art knows how intimidating a blank canvas can be, right? It's not as if we're just released and these creative potential flows out from us. It's something that needs considerable pedagogical support. So the way we investigated is that we revisited some data that my colleagues and I had collected and analyzed for the Studio Thinking project, which has been like a 20-year project. My colleagues at Harvard Project Zero and I have used and worked with in a variety of ways. The book, also from Teachers College Press, is the 3rd edition, just came out. And it may be out of stock, but we're working on that. But in this project, what we really focused on was something that we didn't focus on in that initial analysis, which is how together are the teachers supporting students' agency. And so in this study, we use kind of 3 broad methodological approaches that we integrate to figure this out. And they are, the first one, we just take what other educators have looked at as autonomy supportive practices. This is drawing on the work of Reeve and Zhang. And what they have a whole bunch of things that they say, regardless if you're in an English classroom, a history classroom, wherever you're at, there are things teachers do that support autonomy, students' autonomy, and things that thwart it or that are controlling. And not surprisingly, when we analyzed, these 4 teachers' practices over the course of a year, art classes are very autonomy supportive. Over 3/4 of the interactions were deemed autonomy supportive in our coding. And these are things like providing choices, explaining rationale for your pedagogical decisions, listening to students' perspective and reframing your advice based on that listening, a range of things. So 3/4 of these were autonomy supportive, but we also found that there were these interesting moments of shifts to more controlling practices. And these controlling practices were not they were really controlling of students' art making. And we wanted to understand why. What is that, those momentary shifts of controls? This might be things like, stop looking at that, focus on this. They might say, I want you to stand here and look closely at this portion right here. I want you to look back at your past work and see what you could use here. Just these kind of these commands of action to direct their attention, to direct their thinking. And when we analyzed these, we decided that we found that what was happening is that when you think about what agency in arts means, is there's this we took what is called a temporal lens on agency, informed by Emmerbeyer and Miche. And what it involves is actually almost like a kind of time travel, which sounds a little strange, but essentially, we think any creative open-ended work involves time travel. And what we mean by that is that at any given point in time, you're taking actions, you're involved in the present. So you're working on a piece of art, you are making decisions, you're executing actions, you're characterizing the problem in front of you. But in order to do that well, you both need to reach back to the past habitual, which is looking at selectively attending to parts of the problem in ways that are informed by problems you've experienced before or approaches that you've taken before, and you bring those in to inform your present action. But at the same time, you're imagining possible futures.
You're over 5 minutes.
Oh, am I? My timer said 4. Sorry. I will finish this up. So at the same time, you're imagining potential future actions and envisioning and improvising possible solutions for the work. And what the teachers are doing is taking control of support all of these, but narrating the students as agents of the work as they're discussing the works in progress. All right, thanks. Sorry for the overtime.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you. Just 1 minute over, so I hope the others can do that as well. So thank you. Fascinating summary, wonderful article. As everyone here must know, Erica and I are intimately familiar with these articles, and they're brilliant, and we're very proud of the special issue. So thank you to Kim and her co-authors. So now I'm going to introduce the second paper. We're going to hold off your questions until all of us finish, but you can type in the chat anytime you want a question for any of the contributors. And then at the end, we've scheduled most of the time will be to talk about your questions in the chat. So I'm going to move on to the second paper. And this one is by Ty Hollett and colleagues. They could not be here, so my co-editor, Erica Halverson, will be summarizing their paper. So Erica.
Hey friends, since I have the mic, I just want to say really briefly, the thing that's the most inspiring to me about this group and about these articles is that we are centering arts practice, not in service of the other things that we care about in schools or in learning, but as ways to reimagine what good learning is and what good teaching is. And that has been something I've cared about for a long time. Keith has cared about that for a long time. Kim has cared about that for a long time. And the other, and for the authors who are new to JLS, I know this is something that also really matters to them. And I feel grateful for the opportunity to bring this group together around empirical research that centers arts practice as the object of study and as the output of research. And there's been some energy and enthusiasm around that concept. The other piece that I just wanted to briefly mention from our introduction is the emerging idea that what makes STEAM, for example, STEAM, is not that you drop the arts into a STEM environment, but rather that we understand the epistemological connections between arts practice and science practice, or arts practice and math practice, and that those epistemological connections form the backbone of what it is we aim to do in a learning environment. And I think all of these articles are super successful in doing that. And I hope that for those of you on the webinar who also care about that, this provides a literature foundation for you all to continue to do that work. And I also know that there are some folks on this webinar who submitted abstracts to us. And not only are we grateful to you, but I would say, great, like let's keep pushing that empirical work forward. And now that this foundation exists, there is additional space to continue to identify those epistemological connections, to push on those theories of learning and those theories of teaching. So I'm grateful to all of you for that. And I just got to do that because Ty is not here. So I am also have the pleasure of introducing the article by Tai Hallett, Jinyun Peng, and Susan Land, Learning with and Beyond the Body, the Production of Mobile Architectures in a Ballet Variations Class. And I'm just going to read the summary that I wrote for our introduction, because I spent a lot of time thinking about how a few words could capture this really complicated theoretical idea. So in Learning with and Beyond the Body, Hallett, Peng, and Land study a particular learning arrangement of the ballet studio, the Variations class, to document and understand how ensemble embodied learning happens. And I'll just take a brief pause to say the Variations class was not familiar to me, even though I have been dancing my whole life. Maybe there are dancers on here for whom they're like, yeah, I know what that is. But the Variations class is a class format in traditional ballet studios where dancers learn choreography, particularly choreography from classic ballets. So the Nutcracker, for example, right? The Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies is the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies. And so there are classes set up just for dancers to learn that choreography. So this is not a technique class, right? This is not an experimental class. This is a particular arrangement where, though the dancers vary greatly in their use of those choreographic movements, and the teacher probably has some variation in the way they engage those dancers with the choreography, what they are learning is a set of moves that have been around in many cases for 100 years. And that the goal is for this group of dancers to learn that choreography. They focus on moments of ensemble learning that are propelled by emergent energy in the ballet studio as bodies move in and out of collaborative work. And I want to point out in their use of the word ensemble, Hallett and colleagues are careful to say by ensemble, we don't mean a noun, we mean a verb. And what I think they intend with that is to say that ensemble is itself something that happens. So rather than thinking, and I think the analog to our sort of collective idea of like group work, right, is when we analyze group work, typically we see the group as a fixed entity, right? The group is those 4 kids working on this project. And I think what Ty and his colleagues are pushing us to think about is that the group, the ensemble, is itself something that moves through space and changes and shifts and is influenced and influences the other components of the learning environment, including bodies themselves, the composition of the dance class, the space. And if you read their article, they have some really lovely representations of how space changes as different groups of dancers work on different particular moves at different times in the class. Their fine-grained qualitative analyses of bodies in motion take learning in dance as seriously as we would a small group interaction in a math classroom. And instead of using exogenous measures of learning, that is, is there some sort of pre or post test that will tell us whether or not they've been successful in the variations class, to demonstrate that the instructional strategies were effective or that our theories of how students learn are appropriate to the task, the authors offer a way of seeing ensemble learning as it is happening. They call this form of learning, quote unquote, more than representational, meaning there is energy among the people, music, and learning environment that cannot be captured representationally. And if any of you know me, you know that this is a huge struggle for me. And there was a lot of learning for me involved in this because I am a very representational artist. And Kim, in fact, started me on the path of like, Erica, not all art is representational, and that's a great feature of learning in and through the arts. And so this piece sort of continued to push on and challenge my own biases around the role that representation as a task plays in learning in and through the arts. They're theorizing at the intersection of ensemble and embodied learning is a new intersection of two components of learning theory in our field that have not had a chance to speak to one another. And so I think, personally, the biggest contribution of this piece is a theoretical one, which really aims to articulate how embodied learning is itself an ensemble practice. And again, ensemble in the sense of a verb, not in the sense of a noun. And that's, to me, as Susan mentioned in the introduction, a really interesting theoretical turn in the learning sciences as a field as a whole. And so I look forward to learning scientists who identify in other discipline areas thinking about what that intersection is and means for their practice. I don't know how many minutes that was, but I'm done.
Thank you. I was just about to speak over you like I did with Kim, but I was not counting the minutes at the beginning where you were making general comments, which I really like those as well. So thank you. Great article. And now I'm going to introduce the third article. That one, or I guess the fourth article in the issue, the third of the core articles. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, who will then introduce co-authors and the title of the article. And that is Falashade Solomon. Thank you for joining us.
Greetings. Thank you for having me. Our article was co-authored, obviously, me and Dion Champion, Mariah Steele, and Tracy Wright. Dion is a learning scientist from University of Florida at Gainesville. We had a choreographer, Mariah Steele, from the University of Rochester, and my colleague, Tracy Wright from Turk. And our article is focused on a pilot study that was hosted by the National Science Foundation. And it explores how dance and dance-making practices can create spaces and opportunities for Black girls to bring their cultural and embodied resources to physics sense-making. So for Black girls, issues with access to physics often begin early in learning environments where their resources and contributions can be dismissed and excluded, and their vocally and physically expressive cultural practices are seen as behaviors to be managed rather than resources for science learning. And through studying the situated and embodied cultural practices of these young Black girls in physics learning environments provides a window into the range of resources available for physics exploration, allowing for a shift from dominant conceptual framings of physics as acultural and disembodied to a physics that's more kind of personally filled with affect and emotion and grounded in cultural experiences and relational histories. So in the study, we utilized an expanded funds of knowledge framework to understand how ideational, cultural, and embodied aspects of dance served as resources for physics learning and engagement, and created new pathways for access to physics. And as part of the exploratory study, we designed and examined an embodied physics learning lab, a dance learning environment that offered 15 Black girls opportunities to connect to physics concepts and ideas through embodied imagining, representation, re-representation, and kinesthetic experiences. So in each session, the girls explored forces like gravity, laws of motion, repulsion, and attraction, and charged objects, atoms, elements. And by learning and improvising dance phrases sharing weight with partners, and practicing and analyzing technical dance feats such as jumping and turning. We use these interactional analysis as a way to analyze videos of these activities, specifically focused on moments when the girls worked collaboratively in small groups and in large groups to make sense of physics and choreographic ideas. The embodied exploration of the physics through dance supported sustained engagement, invited the girls to engage in inquiry using multiple movement vocabularies, and offered them opportunities to connect personally and culturally to physics concepts and ideas. And for example, the girls brought out their cultural dance resources into the exploration of properties of the elements, utilizing movements from ballet to represent the lightness of hydrogen, and crumping and stepping, and to represent the density and heaviness of the element iron. The opportunity to explore and express these physical understandings through socially and personally meaningful cultural practices caused shifts in their relationships to physics concepts, their ideas about what parts of themselves belong in the physics learning space, and in their experiences of epistemic power. So as a result, the work really proposed a new way of seeing physics and a new lens for engaging in physics inquiry. Positioning dance as a form of inquiry allowed room for our youth to bring their own creative ways of moving to the table.
Oh, excuse me, I have to say you're over time.
Oh, good, because that was my last sentence.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for this wonderful paper and the great summary. Okay, the fourth of the 4 core articles, I'll introduce again our speaker today, who will then introduce the co-authors or name the co-authors and the title of the paper. And so now I welcome Rolf Steyer.
Yes, hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm Rolf Steyer. I'm presenting on behalf of myself and 2 co-authors, Palmir Perot and Sten Ludvigsen. I'm a professor at Oslo Metropolitan University in Norway, and my co-authors are both at the University of Oslo down the road. So yeah, first, I just wanted to say that it's really nice to be in this webinar and this discussion. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation and the questions we have in a few minutes. In our paper, we were really interested in adolescent group creativity. We found that most of the literature on group creativity focuses on adults acting in professional settings. For example, designers, architects, jazz musicians, and group creativity can help explain how innovations emerge from these groups. This is Keith, for example, has done a lot of work with jazz musicians. In our study, the sort of initial premise was that adolescents, young people, don't necessarily have the same disciplinary knowledge that professionals have. So these explanations of group creative processes might not be the same for adolescents. So our research questions were, how are adolescents' creative imagining processes fostered or hindered in collaborative learning activities? And then the second question was, in which ways do features of collaborative learning activities mediate creative influence in adolescent groups? So the context for the study is a 2-day museum-led architecture workshop. It was developed in partnership with the National Museum in Norway, but the workshop itself was designed to travel around to schools. So it was sort of a blending of environments there, and it would be led by a curator from the museum over this 2-day workshop, where the students were invited to design their own cultural center. And for the purpose of this webinar, with a short introduction, I think there are really just 2 aspects of the project I wanted to highlight. One is the theoretical argument we have related to adolescent group creativity and what these processes look like. And then the second is just the actual learning design, the activity design itself, connected to architecture. And I think it's nice to look at the activity, the tasks that the students are doing, and especially as we compare to the other papers in the special issue. So for the workshop itself, one of the really exciting aspects is that it was heavily modeled after professional practice. We partnered with the museum, as I said, but also with a well-known architecture firm in Norway, Smehete, who designed the Opera House in Oslo, among other things. So the workshop involved the students working in small groups over 2 days in their classroom to design their own cultural center. And I just have one image to show, just because the trajectory of the activity is a little, I don't want to say complicated, but is detailed. So yeah, here's the trajectory. It began on the morning on the first day in the classroom. The students were divided into 4 expert groups, including place, environment, use, and inspiration. These groups traveled to a field site near the school to collect some observations. Then they presented their findings to the rest of the class at the end of the first day. Then on the second day, we followed a jigsaw method, and the groups formed new architect teams, comprised of 1 member from each of the previous day's expert groups. Here they constructed several different models as they built their design for a cultural center. And the roles in this jigsaw approach were based on like a pre-study and partnering with the architecture firm about how they actually work. They used real materials, foams, plastics, topographical maps. So it was very much a serious architecture activity. So that's the task itself. And then I also wanted to turn a bit just to the theoretical side of things. In the study, looking at their group creative process, there were moments of really impressive group creativity where the students were building off of each other's ideas. Everyone was involved. They're using the resources well. They were excited. But there are also moments of frustration where the students couldn't agree. They couldn't find consensus on their ideas, and then they were getting frustrated. So we identified 3 dimensions of group creativity in adolescence, which are material, institutional, and relational aspects. And I won't go into these now, but a key finding is how creative influence is socially negotiated when the merit-based knowledge and authority in the art domain are not valued. So people can present a well-argued idea for why the building should look the way it should, and then these other relational aspects sort of dominate the status of a participant in a group and these kinds of things. So the other big finding to wrap up is that the students' interactions in creative activity can be viewed as evidence of significant learning, even when consensus in the group is not reached. They're still engaging in an architecture process. They're exploring ideas. They're expressing themselves. So even when they are stuck and frustrated, one of our arguments is that learning is happening. So yeah, I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Well, good. Thank you. Thank you for that summary, and thank you to everyone who's spoken. We've now summarized the 4 core articles of the special issue, and it falls on me to summarize the summary or summarize the commentary by Parita Saitama Hakkarainen, who I may be speaking that incorrectly. She is a professor of craft studies at the Department of Education at the University of Helsinki. She's well known for her studies of maker culture, of design learning and technology. I've known her for many years. She's a valued colleague and we're friends. I've been to Helsinki several times. In fact, we're currently working together on a grant to study maker practices and design studio pedagogy at Aalto University, which is a legendary design school in Finland. She's been studying craft and design practices for many years, and we're honored to have her write the commentary, the final article of the special issue. It was very insightful, identified core themes that across all of the articles, and I'm going to pop it up on share my screen very quickly. And I'm also going to put a link here in the chat to the special issue, just in case you want to take a look while I'm talking or during the discussion. So Parita identified 6 common themes that were found in most or all of the articles, which I'll have to run through very quickly because they're actually quite rich. And the core main point I think I should communicate is that all of these themes, all 6 themes, are found throughout the learning sciences in all of the theory and all of the research by our colleagues, regardless of the discipline, whether it's a science field or math or English or whatever language study, all of these in the learning sciences, these themes are found. First of all, the epistemic objects, which for Parita means ideas, thoughts, envisioned possibilities, future-oriented projections, all of those she thinks of as epistemic objects that guide artistic learning. And when we look at learning in the arts and we look at this epistemological framework, we see differently what knowledge is, and it helps us shed a new light on knowing and knowledge in other disciplines. These papers lead to different conceptions of what knowledge is, and that's very exciting for me personally. I think learning scientists in general are very concerned with epistemology, and our special issue connects directly with that. The second cross-cutting theme she identified is that in these learning environments, the focus is on authentic disciplinary practices. Students are learning in the professional practices of the discipline. I guess it goes without saying, perhaps, that these students are not sitting in a lecture classroom. You don't learn to participate in the arts by being passive. Very much active and constructivist learning environment, aligned very closely with what we know of the science of how people learn. The third theme that she identified across the articles is a balance between domain-specific themes and findings and domain general aspects of learning arts. In my introduction, I said we're particularly interested in what arts learning and teaching, what implications it has for teaching and learning in all of the disciplines. And all of these articles do talk about that, but of course they are domain specific as well. But that's true of any article that gets published in the learning sciences. You focus on the discipline as a window into learning more broadly. The fourth common theme is a focus on material embodiment, whereas in these learning environments, it's important to physically engage in the creative practices. It's important to create external representations of your developing understanding using the materials of your creative field, whether it's sketches or models or bodily movements. The fifth common theme is that the pedagogy is not linear. And the knowledge creation processes in art, it's nonlinear, it's emergent, very much different from what Parita says of traditional teaching, is that it's linear and it has a known endpoint. Whereas in arts practice, it's nonlinear, it's iterative. You don't know what the endpoint will be. It's a nonlinear trajectory. And the sixth point she identifies across all of the articles is the interaction between individual processes and collective processes. And again, that's very central, in my view, to all research in the learning sciences. What makes us different from cognitive psychology is that we don't only study what's going on in the head when people are learning, but we're looking at a situated and collaborative and embedded set of practices that contribute to learning. So all of these articles do study collective group practices as well as individual learning. So Parita, I think, did a wonderful job of reaching into all 4 of the articles and teasing out common themes that are across all of the articles, and that also are core themes in the learning sciences more generally. So I'll stop there. I hope I'm within 5 minutes. I should have told Erica, interrupt me if I go over, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I think we're ready. I'd like to start by asking the participants a few discussion questions and to have some sort of, I guess, impromptu discussion. I'm looking at the chat window very quickly. And it looks like, okay, so I'm going to move on to Erica, since I've done most of the talking here and my co-editor Erica Halverson. So my question for you, if you were describing the special issue to one of your colleagues at your university or another university, and it's a colleague who doesn't know anything about arts education, but let's say they study physics education or math education, what would you say to them about the special issue? And would you recommend that they read the articles? I hope your answer is yes. But yeah, so what would you say to your colleagues?
Absolutely not. No. I think I stole my own thunder a little bit. I forgot that you were going to ask me this question. So, I think I'll repeat a little bit what I said before I introduced Ty's article, right? Which is that this special issue centers arts practices as sites for understanding how people learn and how people teach. And as a result, I think the ideas put forth are not only relevant across disciplines, but provide new kinds of insights about what good learning is and what good teaching is, beyond, as you've said several times, Keith, which I really appreciate, beyond arts education as a self-contained set of practices. And that's why I think this collection of articles belongs in the Journal of the Learning Sciences and not in the Journal of, I'm going to get the name wrong, but the Aesthetics and Creativity. There are several journals that focus specifically on arts as self-contained learning domains. And this is not that. And so I would encourage all of our colleagues who don't think of themselves as arts educators or arts practitioners to read these articles for insights about theories of learning and theories of teaching more broadly. And actually, I'm right now, I'm in Irvine at the newly rebooted Games Learning and Society conference. And Jim G, in a way that only Jim G could, gave a talk about how the world is ending, and if we want to stop the world from ending, the people we should look to are artists as designers of learning experiences. I swear he said that unprompted by me, and particularly Rolf pointed out architecture as a field of interest that ought to inform the way we rethink teaching and learning. So I think we have, not only as a group do we have a lot to contribute to the broader learning ecology, but that folks who are pretty pessimistic about the state of education are starting to look to us for mechanisms for redesigning learning environments and rebooting productive ideas about learning. So I recommended the special issue to Jim. I don't know that he reads anything anymore, but he has a platform for describing these sorts of things.
Right. And then at the conference, you raised your hand and stood up and said, you should all read my new special issue.
I'm giving a talk tomorrow, and I promise you, Susan and others, that I will promote this special issue as kind of part of what I think that community, the GLS community, which intersects with ours, but is not 100% the same, might use as an introduction into this intersection of learning sciences and games practice.
Right. Thank you. And as a matter of fact, I'm not a very good blogger. I don't do so well with social media, but I did blog about this. And I hope if someone here read about it from my blog, welcome. And thank you for reading my blog. I have a question for Kim. Thank you for your great paper and your presentation. Your paper represents the visual arts, of course, and you focus on learner agency. And my question is, do you think when students develop what you call artistic agency, when students develop that, does it help them learn better in other subjects? I guess, I mean, does it contribute in some more general way to their cognitive development, not just in the arts?
That's a good question and a perennial one. And I would say my colleagues and I have long resisted the idea of transfer. But at the same time, I think when we dive in and look at how students are supported and what teachers are doing to support students, I think the process and the conception of themselves as agents is something that you could picture them using as a tool to other disciplines. It's not something that we've studied empirically. Well, when it's been studied empirically, I feel it's been studied poorly, and therefore there haven't been a lot of findings. More recently, there's been some findings that support that approach, including my colleague Adam Winsler. But what I would emphasize is that what we saw teachers doing is really teaching students a process, sort of modeling and supporting a process where students say, I'm the agent of my work. What have I done in the past is relevant to what I'm doing now? What are my possible futures? And they start to position themselves as the people who decide what the possible futures are. And I think just that stance, that practice stance, and this is done, we studied it over the course of a year. This is done thousands of times, thousands, literally thousands of times positioning students in that way. And I would have to imagine that stance and that process and some features of that process are what, like Rogoff and Gutierrez would say, repertoires of practice. And those repertoires of practice would be something that become embedded. And then when you're in a new situation, you would take those repertoires and say, how do they apply here? How might they be useful here? And my stance is that as educators, the scaffolding that the studio teachers are doing are readily transferable to other domains. And that scaffolding process of scaffolding with agency centered and these temporal aspects of agency is what really the teacher should be taking from this and moving into the other domains. And I'll just point to my colleague, Abby, who talks more specifically about how language is like a powerful, powerful scaffolding tool. I talk about the content of language, but she looks at the structure of language and how it, I think, helps support this transfer.
Thanks. I'll just briefly say that I think I agree that it's that process that is really the most transferable, that teaching process in particular about supporting agency. And what we also found is that there were some, linguistic tools and markers that teachers use to do this that are teachable, right? So that's something that could be transferred to other disciplines for sure.
Well, thank you. And thank you for those of you who joined late. That was Abby, who is a co-author with Kim on this article. So good. I see we have several questions coming in the chat. Thank you all. And one of them is a question for Rolf. So Rolf, I'll turn to you. If you can see in the chat, the question, I guess, more generally about participating in group work, and then the use of this term soft skills, which generally is thought to include creativity, right? Collaboration abilities. So what would you say, Rolf, about frustration and group work?
Yeah, great question. I think, yeah, as I said, like the premise for this particular study was to look at group creative processes with young people, and soft skills are one of the differences they, develop through and after adolescence. So whereas professional architects, or whether or not they have explicit training in, negotiation and compromise and these kinds of things, 11, 12, 13-year-olds, even when presented with an authentic task, they don't have those kinds of skills. So that's where the frustration came from, is being stuck in a kind of a negotiation. And I mean, the specific is really fun. So I hope people can read the paper, because it's the central debate is one student really wants to have a sledding hill on top of their building design, and the rest of the group doesn't want that idea. So there's just this back and forth debate about the strength of that idea. But yeah, they just don't have the tools to sort of come to a common understanding. And that's where the task breaks down for them. As an opportunity to develop soft skills, absolutely. And that, I think, requires, in this case, it was a sort of guest curator visiting, but it requires the teacher or curator coming in and facilitating those processes, because it's a lot to hand in a 1 day. This is a 2-day workshop, but in a lot of these, it's very dense with lots of different kinds of ideas. So I think that's the kind of thing that would need to be scaffolded by a teacher or by a facilitator to sort of point that out and help them negotiate or work through their problem. And then in our case, the teacher did do that, but it was hard. Yeah.
Well, good. Thank you. And thank you for the question. Please do type your questions in the chat window. And then I have a question I thought of for Falashade, sorry, that in our special issue, we had 4 articles, and when Erica and I were editing it, we didn't decide in advance that we're going to look for a certain set of artistic disciplines, right? So we didn't say we must have one from painting, we must have one from music, and one from dance. We chose the articles based on what we thought would be their implications for broader issues in the learning sciences. And 2 of them turned out to be about bodily movement out of 4. So Eric and I have wondered about that. There's one more that's about architecture, right? And one more about the visual arts. So Falashade, what do you think is the unique relevance of bodily movement to the study of learning?
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning, we play, we dance as a form of meaning making, as we move as a way of meaning making from the beginning. And then somehow in more formal settings, we have less access to the ways that we make meaning. And so for me, in this work, it's about, building out, and what a dance studio affords is this, this widening of what's acceptable movement and acceptable imagining space where you can actually engage in learning using much more of the resources that you have available to you. So for me, I think one of the contributions is really about students, and specifically Black students, feeling like they have, they're accepted for more of the forms of meaning making that they can use to solve the problems that they're thinking about. And so for us, and that doesn't happen in all dance spaces, but there is something about the environment that really showed some acceptable practices that students were then able to kind of build from the ways that they were making meaning that were very culturally sourced connections. And so for me, I think that, having the dance space and having an environment that was really looking and accepting the forms of meaning making that the students were exhibiting really did afford a deeper kind of conversation about the physics that they were learning about. And I think that always happens, but it's about whether they're being kind of confined to use only certain forms of meaning making or resources. And so for me, this article really does speak to accepting both the cultural, the physical, a wider repertoire of sense-making practices.
Good, thank you. And yes, for those of you listening, please do feel free to type questions in the chat. I just thought of a question.
Can I just say one other thing about that is a challenge for not just our field, but for academics, and something that I've been thinking a lot about is how much we privilege the linguistic, right? And I love a linguistic analysis, so it is not that I don't value that, but how we capture and share what learning is and looks like effectively when the site of learning is the body. I think both pieces in this special issue try to deal with that in different kinds of ways. I don't know that as a community, we've been totally successful at doing that yet, because we feel obligated to be reduced back to the journal, to be reduced back to this 30-page representation. But I like the idea that we are beginning in our own inquiries to think about how we do that, and how we, sort of yada the transition from these really meaningful analyses to how we represent and share those ideas back to an intellectual community. And that's just something that I've been thinking about in my own work. And I think that Falashade, as well as Ty and their colleagues, have tried to push on that. And to some extent, visual artists have done that as well. But I don't know, it's a challenge for this collective community, I think. How do we not just study and develop new theories of learning, but how do we then share that back in a way that doesn't inscribe the privilege of the things that school has made problematic for a long time?
All right. I wanted to acknowledge a comment in the chat window before I ask a question to the authors by Emmanuel, who makes a wonderful observation of connecting Piaget to Seymour Papert. And you may know Seymour Papert, considered to be one of the visionary founders in some sense of the learning sciences, and who was studied with Piaget in Switzerland. And I think Papert's work, although very influential in science and math education, was very much about creativity and art and making and embodiment and everything we all are so focused on now. What was it a few years ago at the ICLS conference? I think the theme was the 4 E's, right? It was enacted, embedded, extended, and embodied. And I think that's really what we're seeing here. I have a question for everyone, but I'll start with Kim, because Kim, your article, your study very much focuses on a traditional arts classroom in schools. I mean, I say traditional, it's a exceptionally effective and very good pedagogy, but it is an in-school arts class. And that's the only, of the 4 articles, it's the only one like that. I mean, Rolf's article was in a school, but it was a curriculum that was developed, I believe, outside of the school. And then the other 2 articles study learning environments that are not in schools at all. So I was curious about that. And of course, we all are interested in schools as well as out of school context. So I don't know, does it mean anything that so many people are studying out of school? To what extent do these findings help us if we want to go into a school and tell a high school arts educator what they might do better? So I thought I'd start with Kim on that one, since you know the most about high school arts educators. What do you think about that sort of out of school untraditional environment versus the in school?
Yeah, and it was really exciting for me to do a study that's in school, because a lot of my work I do study out of school. I study maker spaces, museum spaces, community art centers, all sorts of organizations. But I always wonder about how to translate that kind of work back into kind of a setting where there's a teacher and more kids than you can handle, like with the kind of individualized instruction. And the schools, while privileged in some ways, one was a private school that was quite privileged, but had a lot of kids who were learning English for the first time as high school students. And so there were some challenges in that setting. And then also the other school was a public school in Boston, Arts Magnet. And so they kind of represented a range of schools in some ways, even though they were really strong arts programs. And the thing I would say really interests me is that when you work in a school, that the sort of like techniques have a sort of more believability to other teachers, that these pedagogical techniques are possible, that this way of structuring learning is possible, that the kinds of learning, the deep learning, the really personalized learning. I mean, in an hour, teachers interacted individually with students more than 70 times in these classes, because they privilege those individual interactions with students. It's a very different model of learning. Students are talking and having critiques to one another, and there isn't a structured single objective. It's a very diverse, lively environment. And I think having it be in a classroom shows that it's possible to do that in a classroom. And it doesn't have to be this, like spectacular, partnership or anything like that. It's possible to do in a classroom. And these studio art classes, while they're good ones, they look pretty much similar. We've since studied other high schools, and they look kind of the same as good studio art classes look in a lot of different settings. And so I think it is possible. I like that aspect of creating a possible, vibrant education in traditional K through 12 schools.
Do other folks, other authors want to speak to that from their perspectives? Because I think this is sort of like a works in both directions idea. Pausing for wait time. Okay, why not? There's a question in the chat that I think I'm going to start with Abby, but then also open it up because it's taking us back to some of these linguistic ideas. And I'll just kind of reframe the question a little and to ask essentially that if you are going to use linguistic analyses as a mechanism to understand learning in art spaces, around agency, but focused on arts practice, how can those analyses take into account the rich cultural, historical, and dynamic differences among the young people who are participating in these practices? So I'll start with Abby and then see if other folks want to chime into that.
Thanks. That's a great question. And I think, first of all, I think a big piece of it is finding those multiple viewpoints to do the linguistic analysis from, right? So I come from a white privileged upper middle class background. And so my lens on linguistic analysis is through that, right? So there's some reflexivity there, but then there's also, that's one of the reasons that we focused a lot in on the teacher language, right? That those teachers, the ways that they self-presented was sort of was in line with the cultural frameworks that we were coming from to some extent. But I would also say that I would say that having worked with Kim for a few years now, I have learned so much. I'll just say that I was her graduate student. We watched this video of arts learning, and she said nothing was said. Nobody said anything. And afterwards she said, "What happened?" And I said, "Well, nothing. Nobody said anything." And she said, "What are you talking about?" That there was, right? So I think like the actual research process, that analytic back and forth between people with two different or many different analytic lenses is so important. And I think that the insights from this project came out of that back and forth to a large extent, with Kim pulling in that aesthetic embodied piece and me pulling in that linguistic piece.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. And then you can tell me if I put you on the spot too much. Can you think of an example where the cultural and the linguistic come together to give us some insights about agency through the arts? Either an example of something, a teacher move, or a kid practice, something to just give us a little bit of meat hang on to with your response, which I really, really like, but I think feels a little abstract.
For sure. Yeah, no. So I think of one particular instance in the paper where a teacher says, and Kim, you'll have to help me, something like, no, this isn't really, this is, what you're doing is, I'm going to say cartoons, but what we're doing here is oil painting. So what was that? Anyway.
Yeah, so there's a time, I think this is a really good, you're picking out a great instance, Abby. So a teacher is trying to make sense of what a student is asking, and the student is asking, is it cheating if I outline this?
Yes.
And the teacher is saying, it's not cheating at all. Of course you can outline something, but that's a practice and illustration. And we're working in this other field where edge is created by kind of like forms next to each other. And so she was just sort of highlighting that. But the kid pushed against it and talking about, well, my fantasy artist, he doesn't outline, actually, he creates an edge. And so she kind of like openly responded to that. And Abby is just brilliant at analyzing all the technical ways the teacher is shifting her framing of the problem moment by moment in response to the fact that, okay, the kid brought up a resource of a fantasy artist that she has no knowledge of. How does she then respond to and bring that in as a resource that they can use a shared way for discussion? And just sort of flexibly responds to that. And I think that's, so picking that out, I think is one of the best examples for like that kind of cultural shift, because the teacher's coming from one artistic tradition, the kid's coming from another artistic tradition, and they collectively together co-navigate
Yes.
a shared understanding.
Yeah, and you can see that in the linguistics. You can see the teacher's sort of statement of what is or what is not. The kid, the student saying, pushing back against it, asking a question, bringing in another topic or another area that they have expertise on, another discourse that's their discourse, the teacher engaging that discourse. And then that's where you see, and the linguistics points you to that co-construction.
And to make this real pretty, Falashade, I feel like there are parallel examples in your data set of the way dance forms co-create new meanings. And I'm wondering, again, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, if you might share an example from your piece and your data set that at least in my mind is directly, runs parallel to the example that Abby and Kim just shared.
Yeah, so in the paper, we talk about a few instances where the young people are invited in to kind of imagine some of the kind of properties of a particular, element, for instance, hydrogen or iron. And so in those situations, the dance instructor choreographer is kind of asking the students to imagine themselves as a light, white puffy cloud or so there's the imagery, but then there's also like the movements that go back and forth between the teacher and the students, like some of the language components that you're talking about. And so I think really they're communicating in this kind of imaginary world of becoming the phenomena, and really thinking about going back and forth between what movements represent, that, iron as being, dense, versus what movements might represent being kind of light. And then it goes from, like the verbal to the body gestures and back and forth. And so it is like a dance in terms of communicating, using, all of what they have available. And it's also recognizing the teacher, recognizing that when a student, uses, light in more balletic forms to talk about that versus using crumping and or stepping to use, or African dance to talk about something more kind of lower, denser, or more connected to the ground. So it's just kind of accessing and communicating across these different modes and in a really and a flowing kind of interaction. Yeah.
I'd love to follow up on that if that's okay to jump.
That's exactly what I was just gonna do. So take it away.
Well, Falashida, you talked about embodied imagination a few times and that imagination work. And I just, something I'm personally really interested in. I was really excited at the Learning Sciences Conference last week that several of the keynotes made that a core theme. And then the embodied imagination, I think, is really explicit in the dance-based articles here, but that's something we were talking about as well. You know, in your paper, you have imagining these, you know, abstract physics concepts through the body, and in architecture, and or at least in this in this kind, kids are sitting around a table with some, you know, abstract modeling blocks, trying to imagine their building that they don't have a good representation of, and a lot of the breakdowns here, and I think in the other studies as well, come at the disconnect between the thing that they're imagining and the inability to express that to the other, their partners, their group members, the teacher, whoever. So that, like, the best instance that of really successful embodied imagining in our paper is there's a sequence where the whole group is talking about having a gallery space and connecting it to this other space in their design, and then they just start merging ideas. Someone gestures over, well, we need to connect these. What if we have a hallway? And that becomes a, well, we need windows. And then it's like, oh, what if the hallway is a gallery? And like everyone is participating. They're gesturing over the space. They're picking up some of the blocks to sort of represent it so that they collectively imagine this representation of the idea. And when it works well, there's a common understanding. And when they get frustrated, it's because they don't have either the technical skill to sort of express the thing that they're imagining. And that's what needs to develop, I think. And I think that's the kind of big thing in terms of the sort of framing you all had at the beginning of contribution of arts education to the whole learning sciences. I think that's a big area, the sort of learning to express your conceptual understanding or your view of the world in a way that's accessible.
If y'all can believe it, it's already been an hour and 25 minutes. I'm going to pass off to Keith for sort of the final wrap up, but I just want to say a couple of quick things. One is that Susan Giroux, who was at the beginning, who is an editor for the Journal of Learning Sciences, and myself as an associate editor, I think are both happy to continue individual conversations with prospective authors about how some of these ideas might be extended into your own work and might be valuable contributions to the journal moving forward. So if you are a prospective author and you are on this webinar and you have an idea for a piece, I'm speaking for Susan, but she's nodding. I think Susan is a great person to ask, and I am also happy to respond to those kinds of inquiries. All of these authors are leaders in this field, and they've generously come on this webinar today to share that with you. But again, speaking for them, I think if you want to reach out to any of them about the individual work that they shared, these are incredible mentors for all of you in thinking about pushing these ideas forward. So I'm speaking for my colleagues, but I think feel free to reach out to any of them individually, particularly about ideas in their papers and their fields and the spaces that they work in. Keith mentioned 2020. He and I have been working on this since long before that. We proposed this special issue initially in 2017, question mark. And so this has been a 5-year journey. And I'm really honored and thrilled to collaborate with Keith and to collaborate with all of these authors, and to thank all of you for joining the conversation with us. So what a delight. And Keith, I'll pass it off to you for sort of final words.
Well, good. Thank you. And yes, thank you all for participating. I'm very excited by the response and the number of participants. And I wanted to thank everyone who's spoken today. I have something to quickly say. I'm very proud to report that this book has just been published. And I just received this in the mail last week. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this and sharing with you, but I'm still very excited. Let me share my screen for thanks to all of these participants. These are our speakers in the webinar today. Of course, Erica and I as co-authors. And thank you, Erica has already thanked all of these individuals in the journal. Thank you to Kim and Abby, to Falashade, to Rolf for joining us today. And of course, for the contributors who could not be here, thank you for your brilliant article and for everything you've done for this field and bringing us this kind of exposure to the broader learning sciences area to show what arts education and arts education research can offer for the study of learning more generally. Well, thank you all for joining us today. It's time to wrap up and we're all available. So feel free to contact us in the future if you want to follow up or if you have any questions. And please do go to the journal website and take a look at these articles. Thank you.